What do you do about death? In this case, the death of an old father. If you're a modern person, 60 years of age, and a man who's been around, like Woody Selpst, what do you do? Take this matter of mourning, and take it against a contemporary background. How, against a contemporary background, do you mourn an octogenarian father, nearly blind, his heart enlarged, his lungs filling with fluid, who creeps, stumbles, gives off the odors, the moldiness or the gassiness of old men? I mean, as Woody put it, be realistic. Think what times these are. The papers daily give it to you. The Lufthansa pilot in Aden is described by the hostages as being on his knees, begging the Palestinian terrorists not to execute him, but they shoot him through the head. Later, they themselves are killed, and still others shoot others or shoot themselves. That's what you read in the press, see on the tube, mention at dinner. We know now what goes daily through the whole of the human community, like a global death peristalsis. Hi, this is Nick.
This is Nathan.
And this is David. And on today's episode of the Boss Podcast, we'll be looking at two short stories by Saul Bellow, Leaving the Yellow House and A Silver Dish. So Nick, I'm curious why these two stories in relation to the book club's reading of the Bellow novel later.
The longer Bellow book that we'll be reading shortly is Henderson the Rain King. And so that was written in the late 50s. And so we decided to pick two shorts, and we kind of came at it from two different angles. So one being Leaving the Yellow House, which was written immediately preceding Henderson the Rain King. So we figured that would be a good time period to start with. And then I think we've also started viewing Saul Bellow as kind of the quintessential American author. And so we picked The Silver Dish that was published 20 years later in the 1970s as one that had been initially published in The New Yorker, which is obviously the location for lots of quintessential American fiction. So what we didn't know when we picked these was that the topic of death and dying and how old age is dealt with is really the main current running between these two stories. And so as we started reading them, the parallels were very obvious, and just opened up a lot of things to kind of dissect between the two. So I guess on that topic, David, starting out, just how old age is dealt with both works. In between the characters of Woody in A Silver Dish and Hattie in Leaving the Yellow House. How did you find Bellow's approach between those two to differ, albeit 20 years apart?
Well, with the Silver Dish story, we have a character Woody who's he's dealing with, as in the quote you read in the beginning, his father's death. So we have a character sort of looking at the death of a loved one and sort of the distance between that and how that death sort of is dealt with in his own life. And in Leaving the Yellow House, we have a sort of older character on her own, dealing with death, dealing with her own death and her own impending death and what that means for the people around her and what she should do with the things that she has left.
I think it's interesting. The main characters, the protagonists of the stories, are Woody and Hattie, but it's, to me, the character of Hattie and the character of Woody's father, Morris or Pop, are in a way quite similar. In the way that they approach death is similar in a way, but it's interesting to see in one story an outside perspective to that, and on the other story that person's own internal struggle with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I guess, Nathan, can you describe a little bit more what that approach is and how that's shared between Hattie and Pop?
Well, I think that they both struggle to accept their own death. They both live a very independent, rugged kind of life that, a selfish life, really, in a way, and pursuing their own desires. And so when it comes to their death, their death doesn't really fit into the paradigm that they've set up for themselves.
I think in Hetty, though, as that story progresses, it's how she fits in her death to the paradigm of the life she's sort of created. Whereas with Woody's father, with Pop, his struggle in the face of death, it's never really resolved. He dies in the struggle,
which I thought was beautiful. I love the ending of that story, when he describes how he's Woody is holding Pop in in the hospital bed, like telling him to let go and stop struggling, and Pop fades away, and then Woody's left feeling with the sense that Pop rebelled against him even to the end. Pop wouldn't obey the rules. I thought that was beautiful. And for Hetty, we don't see kind of how she ultimately goes. We don't know if she ever kind of resigns herself to that. And the last moment that we see her in that process is, rebelling against the notion that she can't take all of this stuff with her, or take the house with her, because that's really the only thing she has.
Right. So when I think about these two stories, I sort of wonder it from the way that Bellow is writing them and how he approaches the same topic 2 decades apart. And, there is similarities between Hattie and Pop. But I feel like the most interesting thing is really what Bellow came to present in the character of Woody, and sort of this extremely unselfish man. He takes care of his father, the rest of his family, his father's mistress, all of these external family connections, and is really kind of a simple man, almost in an in-between space for most of his life. But at the same time, he doesn't read as a sad character. He reads as somebody who sort of understands, what his vices are, what he needs to do to make himself happy. He loves things that are honest and straightforward and fully apparent. And so I sort of wonder, as Bellow himself was getting older and he was starting to evaluate what old age meant to him. Sort of the difference between the perspectives of the story, where, in the 50s, he was writing about Hattie, who's basically going blazing into the darkness at the end of the story, versus Woody, looking at his own father, who's he's not necessarily more contemplative, but it's almost like he's accepting of the lack of definition of it. So I'm kind of curious if you guys saw it similar, different, something like that.
I think it's a lot more contemplative for Woody, but for Pop, I don't think you really get to see, or at least Woody doesn't get to see, any sort of contemplation at the end of his life. You still see an old man, kind of refusing to give in to his last moments. And in that way, I think the elder characters of Pop and Hetty are similar, whereas the distance more is through Woody, how other characters deal with the death of those around them.
Yeah, I mean, they're both stories are quite nostalgic, I think, or have a nostalgic perspective from old age. But it's interesting that the nostalgia in a Silver Dish isn't Pop's nostalgia. I guess in the story he's actually, in present time, he's dead, so obviously it's not his nostalgia. But Woody's looking back on elements of his father's life and trying to explain to himself who his father was. And Hetty is looking back on her life and trying to explain to herself who she is.
So yeah, that perspective I think is really interesting. And there's a quote from Hetty that I really love, which is, "The notion that in this emptiness someone saw her was connected with the other notion that she was being filmed from birth to death, that this was done for everyone, and afterward you could view your life, a hereafter movie." And so that sort of, to me, establishes, where the focus is in between the two stories. And you're right, we don't get that view into Pop, but we get that view into Hetty, and then also just the simple view that that's also how she herself is viewing her. Externally, what would it look like? What would these moments really be? And so it's almost like if you summed up the two stories, you get a similar full view of what each character is looking at, albeit different stories, different characters, but the arc of it is very similar between the two.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think, oddly enough, when I read that quote, I thought, Hetty, if you really believe that, you are making yourself a really shitty protagonist. Because I guess her perception of herself never reached the way that I imagined Pop perceived himself.
Yeah, she was trying to reach that level of narcissism.
I think so.
attempted but failed narcissism.
Yeah, and that was like her last grasp too. It was like, I can't give it away. But she ultimately, I think she ultimately didn't really believe in herself. And Pop did, and that was like his vice, but
It was also his vitality. Like
yeah, exactly, yeah.
like even though in the scenes you see of Pop being such a terrible father, there's a part, at least a part of me, and I think purposely done on Bellow through Woody's end of narrating Pop as somewhat heroic, oddly enough.
Yeah, totally.
Because I think as the story is, as a Silver Dish is framed by the sound of those church bells in that one day, that one morning of mourning, you sort of get an idea of Woody looking back on his father as somewhat of a heroic character who saved him from going down a path he most likely shouldn't have gone down.
Oh, that's interesting. That I didn't really think about it that way. I mean, he does say that, but I saw it as Pop trying to manipulate the situation to make himself look like the good guy again, and not that really Woody, who's a pretty passive character. Not that he would have really cared one way or the other. Like he would have found his way to be simple and happy as a reverend ultimately, and he would have been the same person as he became with the whatever he was, a tile salesman or something. You know, he would have been kind of the same person in a different situation. That was my thought on it. But Pop kind of rewrote the story. He's like, oh no, you never would have been happy doing that. You should be glad that I, totally ruined your relationship with your patroness, matron.
All the above.
Yeah, no, I think there is a bit of a sort of thankfulness in Pop's reminder that Woody should be a little more selfish.
Exactly. And yeah, so I think Woody's worldview is something that has been given a lot of focus. And the quote that that Bellow gives is that while Woody is sort of younger and working at the fair, he has this sort of revelation as to what he feels is like honest and true. And he's thinking out loud. God's idea was that this world should be a love world, that it should eventually recover and be entirely a world of love. He wouldn't have said this to a soul, for he could see himself how stupid it was, personal and stupid. Nevertheless, there it was at the center of his feelings. And so when I think about Woody and sort of his relationship to Pop, and as he goes through his life, his feeling for how things should be obviously has a disconnect for both Pop's approach and how most of the external world operates. But at the same time, it's clinging on to kind of this simplified, more pure approach. And yeah, you're right. There is the quote where they talk about his greatest weakness being his unselfishness, and that's coming from Pop's side. And meshing those two together, where in the end, as Pop slips away, it's viewed as one more final rebellion against Woody, and seeing that tied back, it was a very beautiful moment.
And I think both of these stories kind of deal with like how to live a life. And in A Silver Dish, you have that kind of dichotomy between Woody, who's living unselfishly and kind of in the wake of his, turbulent father, and Pop, who's living very selfishly and has like a very selfish explanation for everything. And then you have Hetty also, who's kind of trying to make herself happy and trying to do these things, but ultimately can't quite make the right decisions about things.
But I don't think it's a lack of self-belief, or maybe it is. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe this is not so much a story about death and dying. Maybe it's more about the value and limits of vanity and self-belief. But because I'm trying to think of what distinguishes, or what the difference is between Hetty going out of this world and Pop going out of this world. Whereas, like Woody, we get some value, or he sort of evaluates Pop's life and his relation, whereas Hetty has no one.
Yeah.
She can't even figure out who to give her house to when she dies, so she decides fuck it, I'm just going to give it to myself.
I mean, if you look at it in like the continuum of Bellow's life, and that he wrote A Silver Dish 20 years later, and I don't know that much about Bellow personally, but both of these stories are kind of writing about a selfish life, and in Hetty's story, it's a very depressing story of a selfish life. It's like, if you live selfishly, you'll end up alone. Let's just moralize these things. If you live selfishly, you'll end up alone, and what you've gained in life will amount to nothing. And 20 years later, he writes the story about a selfish man who lives a selfish life. But there is an apologetic for that selfish life delivered by his son that's saying, ultimately, even though Pop didn't really care about me, he didn't really care about anybody, he only cared about himself, even to the end. He made my life better. And so it's almost like it's possible to live a good life selfishly.
It's more like your life is valued by who laments you in the end.
But it's funny
without
though.
Woody, without Woody, who would speak up for Pop? No one was there with him in the hospital. Nobody was there with him in the bed.
It's funny that you bring that up, because Woody wasn't. I mean, the paragraph that Nick read at the beginning, Woody was really trying not to mourn for Pop and explaining why he didn't need to mourn for Pop, kind of.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point in that how death is treated between the two stories, and it's kind of like, you mentioned like the arc of Saul Bellow in his writing career, and just progressing from a younger writer to an older writer. One thing that I've found is earlier Bellow works, starting with like Dangling Man, which was really kind of like a surprisingly angry and like existential book, into Adventures of Augie March, which is sort of quintessential American fiction in the mid-century kind of way. Like a lot of those are really like upstream, like how do you define yourself? How do you find your place? How do you really make it happen yourself? And I think when Leaving the Yellow House was written, which is right around that time period, that Bellow still had a lot of that energy, and he was trying to approach what old age and death and dying was like through that mindset. But 20 years later, when he got into A Silver Dish, I think he was starting to accept some of the, I'm going to go with the term, bewildering qualities of death. And I think this is actually summarized really early in A Silver Dish, when Woody is talking about a realization, or referred to one of Woody's realizations on a trip he had to Africa. And I'll read a section. Also, he had traveled extensively in Japan, Mexico, and Africa, and there was an African experience that it was especially relevant to Mourning. It was this: on a launch near the Murchison Falls in Uganda, he had seen a buffalo calf seized by a crocodile from the bank of the White Nile. There were giraffes along the tropical river, and hippopotamuses and baboons and flamingos and other brilliant birds crossing the bright air in the heat of the morning, when the calf, stepping into the river to drink, was grabbed by the hoof and dragged down. The parent buffaloes couldn't figure it out. Under the water, the calf still thrashed, fought, churned the mud. And so when I think of that, I think it's ties into, and this quote is alluded to another time or two in later Silver Dish, is just the accepting of, even in the natural world, in the animal kingdom, death is still this thing that happens that they haven't fully figured out, that it's just this bewildering element, and really trying to define it and come to terms with it is almost an impossible task. And so when I read these two stories, and yes, they're from different perspectives, but the same topic to me is approached very differently, and I think it really shows a lot of how Bellow shifted in his writing over the years, and honestly kind of found ways to roll in a little bit more humor and a little bit more acceptance of some of these hard topics versus when he was a younger writer and was just going full bore at them.
It's certainly more subtle, the difference between the two stories and how people deal with it. And that might be the time and distance in Bellow's life, but I think it also has to do with the character. Like, Hetty is not a subtle person. She's a loud old drunk. And I think that sort of shades the way the reader understands how the story deals with death, because you're getting it through her.
I don't know. She very clearly says that the reason she crashed her car was not because she was wasted, because she sneezed. So, quite frankly, I don't know.
I mean, that's the story she makes up after she crashes and repeats over and over again until she convinces herself that it's true.
Exactly. Why would
Yeah,
she say something that wasn't true that many times over? It's obviously the truth.
exactly.
That's her life. I mean, everything about her was a lie. And I mean, she was trying to convince herself that it wasn't. I mean, she repeats over and over that she wasn't actually Western also. And she was trying to live this Western life. And I mean, I think that's a very consistent aspect of her character.
I think I think that has to go, and that goes back to kind of. I know we're going to be quoting a lot from A Silver Dish here, but there's a moment where Woody talks about how honesty moves him, and I think that goes back to him thinking about his father's death and him thinking about the idea of death and mourning when he's in Africa. I'm just going to read it real quick. Woody was moved when things were honest. Bearing beams were honest. Undisguised concrete pillars inside high-rise apartments were honest. It was bad to cover up anything. He hated faking. Stone was honest. Metal was honest. These Sunday bells were very straight. They broke loose, they wagged and rocked, and the vibrations and the banging did something for him. Cleansed him inside, purified his blood. The bell was a one-way throat, had only one thing to tell you, and you simply told it. And simply told it. He listened. And I think in there is him understanding not only his father's way of living, like his father, being a selfish man, was an honest person with himself. Like there's that scene where he comes into the backyard when he's a kid and just says, "I'm leaving. Your wife, or my wife and I, your mother and I, we can't live together anymore." And there's little scenes like that where he's just completely honest with who he is as a person. And yet, maybe because of that honesty, he can't accept his ultimate death, which is why he fights it. Whereas I know there's some debate in our pre-recording conversation about whether or not Hetty gives in or continues to fight at the end of the story. But either way, I think it sets up the fact that she's not an honest person. There's not honesty within her about who she is and how her life has been.
Yeah, she definitely spends the entirety of her life trying to convince her that this path she's taken is the right path. And, her prior marriage to somebody of, some level of Philadelphia notoriety, and her not wanting to change her name from that because it gave her class. But at the same time, she's chosen this Western existence as sort of a fuck you to the idea of that even though she had that, this is where she truly belongs. But in reality, she's just trying to try it on over and over and make it fit. And to me, it seems like a failed version of, if you can't have what you want, learn to want what you can have. And so even towards the end, she's trying to figure out how do I convince myself that, I didn't screw up earlier, but this was my, spot that I should have been and kind of my destiny all along. But it's not a fit, and she just spends all of her life just against the grain, which at some level, we're kind of ragging on Hetty a little bit right here, but I think some of that tenacity is admirable, and I don't necessarily view her as stereotypically selfish. Because she does mention, talking about having children versus not having children, and she accepts that, like, she just didn't have it in her to have children. And I think that that's actually a very, like, honest thing to address and admit to yourself. Sort of I don't have everything else fully worked out, so, having kids would obviously be a bad idea. So, like, I don't think she actually has some level of viewing herself externally with regards to that. But I think it's the trying to continually fit into something that was never a fit from beginning that gives her some of those selfish, failed, narcissistic qualities.
Yeah, she's not a completely flat character. I didn't mean to sort of paint her as such, but yeah.
I mean, I found Hetty to be, basically a pretty contemptible character. Like, if I met a person like this, I don't think that I would have a very high regard for them. But in the story, she's very sympathetic, and I think that Bellow draws out, universal applications from this person that I probably want to have a very long conversation with in real life, or take her concerns all that seriously. And maybe I'm just not a very sympathetic person, but um, it this person that feels so distant from me and my experience, and I can say, you know what, I have those feelings too. I know what it's like to feel like I don't belong here, like I'm putting on these clothes and trying to be something that I'm not. And she's just an extreme example of that. But I found this in both stories actually, or in everything that I've read of Bellow, is like this ability to pull out kind of universal truths or universal values from fairly fringe existences.
He certainly has a way of getting the reader to sympathize with his characters, even if you find some of their actions deplorable.
Right, and I think, pretty much everything I've ever read by Bellow, nobody is painted purely in a good light. Everybody's, shown to the reader the positives and the negatives, and I've found it really easy to identify with just about anyone that I've ever read about. And a lot of this has to do with the time period he was writing in, and Bellow himself, I think, coming from a very poor upbringing, and then coming through the Depression, and then the mid-century boom in America and all that. And so a lot of these stories have to do with how you define yourself and how you reinvent yourself, and sort of what some of those transitions look like, and some of the tensions and social conventions that you meet along the way. And so, I found things in Hetty, I found things in Pop, I found things in Woody that, just because it's described to like such perfect detail and written in, excellent prose, and he's really a guy that nails the specifics in a lot of these cases. I found things across the board that I'm just like, yeah, I do stuff like that. Yeah, I can see that. And everything, like you mentioned, David, is not, it's not flat. It's fully built out, and that's kind of one of my favorite things about Bellow.
I mean, would Pop almost be an exception to that? Because Pop is kind of a pure character in a way that Woody and Hetty are not.
Yeah, I think Pop definitely serves kind of a purpose of being that, of being almost an ideal.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a positive versus negative ideal, but being this force. And I think that's kind of how he's used. And Pop was kind of committed to it from the beginning. When you compare him versus Hetty, he was kind of a street boy, right, who was abandoned, and then through whatever combination of vices and tricks and pool room parlor stuff, managed to string along an entire life. And I think the way he's written is not necessarily to be the one that you dig deep into, but to use as a force on Woody himself.
Yeah, and just to kind of drive that point home, I love this passage where at the end of their wrestling match over the silver dish, and he says, "This is Woody." He says, "He was overcome. He was then overcome with many, many bad feelings of a sort he knew the old man never suffered. Never, never. Pop never had those groveling emotions. There was his whole superiority. Pop had no such feelings. He was like a horseman from Central Asia, a bandit from China. It was Mother from Liverpool who had the refinement, the English manners. It was the preaching Reverend Doctor in his black suit. You have refinements, and all they do is oppress you. The hell with that."
Yeah, Pop was pure. And I'm going to steal the thing that you already mentioned, but Pop as Gene Hackman from the Royal Tenenbaums,
Right?
which is just fucking dead on. And I'm gonna read one of my favorite quotes about him. Is It's an exceptionally smart man who isn't marked forever by the sexual theories he hears from his father, and Woody wasn't all that smart.
I like that he dumbs down his characters.
Yeah,
way.
exactly. Like,
I think that's a really sneaky thing to do.
yeah, like the way Bellow presents everybody, and another thing that I love about him is nobody's so highbrow that they're lacking a lot of these things. And so he always like accepts the fact that, we're humans, we have these problems, we have these addictions, these vices, these behaviors. And so like as he builds this out with Woody especially, and reading that quote, and I also love how much that is just something that can exist in a vacuum, where everybody's got some sort of dirty comment from a dad or an uncle or a grandpa that like that just like immediately resonates so highly, and like that quote will just to me, it kind of can like live on in by itself in infamy because everyone's just like, yep, that's just how dirty old dudes work.
I think on the subject of like Bellow dumbing down his characters, or his characters are kind of stupid, but they're really not. I mean, they're really deep and they make really profound observations about the world, but they do it in a very simple way. I think it makes his reading his work very accessible, and it like slips in these observations or these aphorisms about the world that come from the mouth of people that you're not looking for those kind of observations. I think it's quite a craft.
Yeah, and this is going to be the vast majority of the topic when we start talking about Henderson the Rain King, because that's maybe like the most amplified version of this, is taking a character who is boisterous and loudmouth and stuff, but it's also mixed with lots of these subtle observations and all that. So I'm really excited to talk about that on the next episode.
Yeah, I'm pumped to talk about that. I just started it and I love it, and can't wait to get into it.
So all you listening out there, make sure to read Henderson the Rain King for the next episode. Check us out online at booksofsomesubstance.com or follow us on Twitter at booksosubstance. Until next time, peace.